Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So let me just introduce the panel to you briefly before they kick off the proceedings. So on my far left we have Professor John Hedley Brooke, who was previously the Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University. He's also the President of the International Society of Science and Religion. Historian by background, has done a huge amount of writing in this area, particularly on the history of the role of religion in science. Then on my immediate left, as I mentioned, is Dr. Rodney, who started out life here in Cambridge doing maths, doing mathematical physics, doing astrophysics as a postdoc, and then later on became ordained in the Church of England, much later on, and is now a course director in the Revd Institute, which is why I felt quite free to phone him up late last night and ask if he could stand in today, so we're very grateful to him for that. Then on my right here is Dr. Usama Hasan, who's a senior lecturer in engineering at Middlesex University, and he's also a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, and he's also a part-time imam at the Tawhid Mosque in London. And then, last but not least, on my extreme right is the Reverend Dr. John Polkinghorne, who I think will be known to many of us here, who was previously the Professor of Mathematical Physics in Cambridge for 25 years, and then had a complete changing career, became ordained in the Church of England, and came back then later on to Cambridge to become President of Queen's College, Cambridge. He's also a Templeton Prize winner. I'm sure John must be in the Guinness Book of Records for writing more books on science and religion than anyone else in the world. I can't possibly keep up with them. A reminder to say there is a bookstall outside, and so I think we'll have time to browse that afterwards. So we're very pleased to our four very busy panelists for coming along this afternoon. Let me just explain the format. We're going to allow them 3 minutes each, maximum 5, to address the overall theme of our discussion this afternoon, which is science and religion, friends or foes. And so we'll give a kind of, if you like, position statement. I'm going to start on my left just in a moment, because we always start in history, I think. It's always a good place to start, and work up to modernity, as it were. And then the panel may want to have a little bit of discussion amongst themselves, or they might not. We'll see what happens. Points of clarification, all that sort of thing. But really we want to throw open the discussion to everybody here and spend nearly all our time in hearing what you think, or rather getting questions as well, questions and discussion.
Good afternoon. It's an enormous pleasure to be with you. The question you will remember is science and religion, friends or foes? As a historian, I have to say my first reaction to that question is to view it with some suspicion. And the reason I do so is that one thing history shows is that science has been appropriated many times, both for the support of religious belief and for attacks on religious belief. One always then has to ask the question, whose science are we talking about? And whose religion are we talking about? It's sometimes pointed out that there was no equivalent of the Galileo affair in Muslim communities. Differentiation, discrimination is what a historian would be looking for in any kind of analysis of this very interesting topic. So, whether you see science and religion as partners or as in opposition is likely to depend on where you are coming from. And I say that because attitudes towards religion in particular are shaped by many social and cultural parameters. Francis Bacon in the 17th century, a great apologist for science, claimed that the greatest threat to religion came not from science, but from religion. Think about it. The context, which is what always grabs historians, means one needs to look at the local circumstances in which statements are made about the relations between science and religion. And just to give you one example, recent scholarship on the reception of the Darwinian theory in Presbyterian religious communities has shown that the reaction was very different in Belfast, from Edinburgh, from Princeton. There's contrast in the reactions between northern states in America and southern states. Even there was difference in perception between Highlanders in the north of Scotland and the lowland literati in Edinburgh. So the issues are not straightforward. Historians are interested in the mutual relevance of science and religion, because religion has played a key role in the rise and indeed the sustenance of science in different cultural traditions, particularly in Western Europe in the 17th century, where beliefs about the regularity of nature, about the dependability of nature, about harmony and beauty in nature were often underscored by religious presuppositions. But of course science also impacts on religion, sometimes in the past at least lending support. The invention of an instrument like the microscope, just to give one salient example, created a great sense of wonder because it magnified the contrast between man-made artifacts and the works of nature. It seemed to imply that the craftsmanship of God was so much superior to what human craftsmen could make. So, science relevant to religion, religion has been relevant to science in all kinds of interesting ways. Finally, from the historian's point of view, I think there is an onus to correct mythologies. If you'll forgive me just for a moment, I was once interviewed by the BBC in Northern Ireland where I was speaking, and I asked not to be asked questions about the troubles, about the Catholic-Protestant tension, which was at its height at that time. And that was agreed, and then the first question I was asked was, did I believe Catholics or Protestants had made the greater contribution to science? Now, actually I said they'd both done pretty well under the circumstances. But I tell that story because it was what the interviewer said next that really stung. He said, we all know that Galileo was burnt at the stake for believing that the earth is round. Well, they all knew that in Northern Ireland, apparently. But that's just an extreme example of the kind of mythology, the anecdotal aspect of the relations between science and religion that I think historians are in a good position to correct. It's often said that science was liberated from religion during the 17th century. You've only got to look at Isaac Newton's life and deep dedication to the study of scripture and making all kinds of connections between his natural philosophy and his religion to realize what a simplification that mythology is. Or it's sometimes said Darwin destroyed natural theology. Again, it's a myth, because if you read Darwin himself, you will see that he's willing to talk about design laws operating within the universe. So there's a lot of mythology to clean up, and I'd like to think that historians do at least have a role in attending to that. If I've learnt one lesson, this is my final comment, if I've learnt one lesson as a historian looking at these debates over the years, it's this, that we need to be very suspicious of claims that scientific theories entail definitive conclusions about theological and metaphysical issues. Because that language of entailment, I think, is deeply misleading. And from the historian's point of view, it seems to me scientific theories are almost always, perhaps even always, susceptible of both theistic and atheistic readings. And the finest theologians have acknowledged that too. I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. So Rodney Holland will now give a few minutes. Thank you, Rodney.
Well, thank you. I thought I'd start by saying a bit about my own background, which was a boyhood interest in astronomy. I read all the Patrick Moore books, if older members of the audience would know him. And got some telescope and so on. I was fascinated by astronomy. And then I came up to Cambridge to read mathematics, which seemed just the right subject if I wanted to pursue certainly theoretical work in astrophysics or cosmology. And that was the point where I became a Christian. And I have to say that I have never found there to be any conflict. It seemed to me that when one studied the universe, one was studying God's creation. Kepler, one of the early pioneers of the so-called scientific revolution, said he was thinking God's thoughts after him. And it seems to me that it actually adds something to our perception of the grandeur of God and the majesty of God when we understand what a star is. The sun is 860,000 miles in diameter, and it's pumping out 400 million watts of power. Gigantic nuclear furnace. Well, when we know that sort of thing, how many stars there are in the observable universe, is that something to be scared of if religious believers, or is it something that actually adds to the awe and majesty we feel about God? Well, for me, it's the latter. The psalmist looked up at the heavens and said, "The heavens declare the glory of God." We know so much more now, and it seems to me that is enhancing. Certainly if one is already a religious believer, that's enhancing one's perception of God. So there certainly is a perception that science and religion are friends and foes, and it seems to me that there are two main reasons why that's so. Well, one is that, and I think it comes from two extremes really, both in the scientific community and in the religious community. You get polar opposites. So you get scientistic fundamentalism, where the claim is that science answers every kind of question we might want to know, and that seems to me to be plainly false. Science doesn't tell us about ethics, it doesn't tell us about meaning and purpose in the universe. And then at the other pole there is the fundamentalist religious believer, the Christian who takes the early chapters of Genesis totally literally, and that seems to me to be a mistake too, to read what is a theological text as a scientific text, and that seems to me to be completely mistaken. One can perfectly easily hold these chapters to be the inspired word of God without that narrow literalistic interpretation. And then it does seem to me that just as I was leaving astrophysics in about 1980, there had been some very interesting insights coming out of that world of cosmology, discovered by cosmologists with no religious axe to grind, that the Big Bang seems to be set up in a very particular way, the so-called fine-tuning of the universe. Sometimes the expression anthropic principle is used. That the initial conditions of the Big Bang, the constants that go into the laws of physics, need to be what they are to fine degrees of accuracy in order to give rise to an interesting universe in the first place. Now that seems to me, well, one way you can take that is that it's a pointer towards there being a designer. It doesn't entail it. John is absolutely right about that, and of course you have to consider other options, multiverses and so on, other what I regard as metaphysical options. But certainly looking at the universe and at the various features about the universe, such as that intelligent life has arisen, at least somewhere, that we are rational creatures with free will, and that has we've arisen through a long process of evolution, starting with the Big Bang, points to me to there being a God behind it. Some alternatives, but it seems to me, at the very least, entirely consistent with my beliefs and not antagonistic.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Usama.
Thank you, Professor. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. With the name of God. So, religion and science, friends or foes? As an imam and as a Cambridge trained physicist and astronomer, obviously I'm going to say they're friends. Well, in my view, they're friends, and Newton is one of my heroes, because I suppose I'm trying to follow a similar approach, having studied scripture all my life and memorized the entire Quran by the age of 11 and continuing to teach and study that, but at the same time fascinated by learning about all the wonderful secrets and miracles of science. But I think, to be fair, it might be fairer to say that they are friends in principle, certainly for believers, but often foes in practice. And there are many examples we could give of that. I'd like to give just some insight from the history of Islam in this regard. I'd recommend a book by Professor Jim al-Khalili, who's a famous TV scientist now, if you like. In his book Pathfinders, about the history of Arab and Islamic science, he argues strongly that one of my namesakes, Hasan ibn al-Haytham, a great physicist from Iraq actually, and later in Cairo, that he should be credited as the father of the scientific method, because he wrote something very similar to Bacon centuries before Bacon. And in fact, there are many examples of this in the history of the scientific contribution to Islam. In fact, there was a major exhibition in the Science Museum in London a couple of years ago on the history of Islamic science, and it quickly became the most successful exhibition in the museum's history. Its time span had to be expanded, had to be doubled from 3 months to 6 months, because of the sheer numbers of people who came to look at that. So it's very easy for Muslims to say that there is no problem between science and religion, but clearly there are, and our two esteemed speakers have mentioned some of those before us. And in a nutshell, how do I go about trying to resolve this? Well, it's largely, well firstly, I do take the position that science cannot prove or disprove the existence of God, and in fact that is it's widely accepted by many theologians and scientists, even believing scientists, if you like. In fact, it's an established classical Islamic theological position. The great Muslim theologian Al-Ghazali, who lived about 1,000 years ago, and Ibn Taymiyyah, who lived about 700 years ago, both argued that position. In fact, they refuted the earlier Muslim philosophers like Avicenna, who were Aristotelians, who had argued that you could prove the existence of God, for example. So to me, we see so many wonders and miracles in physics and in biology, in every area of science. And of course, as believers see that as God's way of working being revealed. But it cannot be proven. For me, it's a personal choice. You look at all these wondrous things, and you may decide that this points to divinity, or in the Quranic term, everything is a sign of God, pointing to a higher world, and especially to oneness, to the principle of oneness, which the Quran over and over emphasizes, a very strong emphasis on monotheism, or the oneness of God. Or you may think it's not proven, and you remain agnostic or atheist or whatever your position is. And I think that's fair enough. I think we have to continue that discussion. There seems to be a lot of animosity in this debate often. And nobody can really claim to have all the answers, if you like, especially in terms of how we behave. Which is, I suppose, the second aspect, that of ethics. As the Professor said, science doesn't actually give us detailed ethics, certainly not. And I think people often miss the point is that science deals with the detail, but at such a low level, if you like, in theoretical physics and biology, we're dealing with the basics, if you like, that science really don't have the time, or haven't had the time to solve all the more complex problems, or for example, the social sciences, human behavior. In principle, perhaps these things could be solved. We know the brain and the mind is so complex. But it would be unreasonable to ask scientists to solve the problem of how we should live, for example, ethics. And there, we do have, practically, we do have other sources. Many people have their ethics informed by religion, not everyone, of course. And there's that element of wisdom. I have scientist friends who explain wisdom as the accumulated human ways of doing certain things, for example. but you can't prove that that's the only way to behave. What will people do? Darwinian analyses of altruism, for example, and say it's the evolutionary advantage to be unselfish and to be altruistic. That's a particular viewpoint. But I'm talking about things like love, mercy, forgiveness, forgive your enemy, etc. Those are powerful moral and ethical perspective, if you like, which it seems to me science is not in a position to provide at the moment. And people have to make the choice. The faith that they do provide these kinds of teachings, is that a reasonable, is that a good thing we want to discard or not? But we have to continue, if you like, challenging religion. All good believers, I think, should question their own religious tradition and teaching and dogmas, and continue grappling with those issues. And often it may be true that insights that scientists come up with, religious people will say, well, we told you so centuries ago. And I suspect that's the kind of thing Newton saw in his life, and it's certainly something I come across in Muslim readings of the scripture and of tradition. I'll give one example, a couple of examples. One is that Michio Kaku, in his book Hyperspace, at the end of it, he speculates and mentions something that many physicists do, which is, we have an astounding amount of information about how we believe the universe came about. But what's the point of all this? Why us here with our intelligence? Why did it happen this way? And many physicists say things like, well, isn't it great that everything worked out this way, so that we could look back with our telescopes and discover the wonders of quantum theory and relativity, and look back billions of years with our telescopes and see the Big Bang. So in a sense, we are at the pinnacle of all of that. Well, actually, the religious tradition have said that for centuries. They've said things like, for example, in the Islamic tradition, that God created the world to be known, or God was a hidden treasure and created the world to be known. And it is human beings, being the most advanced or intelligent of God's creatures, and endowed with a soul, or being taught the name of everything, or created in the image of God, whichever way you want to express it, who are then able to look at everything around us and try to discover these deep secrets. So there is no good purpose for our existence as it is. But I think that the debate should continue, of course, in a civilized way, between people who have a scientific, perhaps a purely scientific approach, a scientific rationalist approach, people who have a religious approach, and many who take a bit from each side and try to make sense of how best to continue learning and living. Thank you very much.
Well, I certainly think that science and religion are friends and not foes, and I think the basic reason that they're friends, that they both participate in the great human quest for truth to be attained through well-motivated beliefs. The question of truth is as central and essential for religion as it is to science. Religion can do all sorts of things for you. It can guide you in life and strengthen you in the approach of death, but it can't really do any of those things unless it's actually true. Otherwise it becomes an exercise in illusory fantasy. So they're both looking for truth, but of course they're looking for different they're looking for different aspects of the great single truth about the nature of reality. Science is asking only a particularly limited set of questions. It's purchased its great success by the modesty of its ambition. It simply asks the process of the world. How do things happen? How do things come about? A very important question to ask, and science is stunningly successful in finding answers to it. There are other questions to ask, questions of purpose and meaning and value. Is there something going on in what is happening? And those are questions that science just brackets out, but they're meaningful questions. And these are the sort of questions that religion addresses, in my view. To use a very homely example that I'm rather fond of, the kettle is boiling, A, because gas heats the water, that's the answer in terms of process. B, because I want to make a cup of tea, that's an answer in terms of purpose. I don't have to choose between those two answers, they're both true. In fact, if I understand the mysterious event of the boiling kettle, I need both answers. Excuse me, I think I need the insights of both science and religion if I'm going to understand what's going on in the world. Also, they address different forms of encounter with reality. Science is based upon an objective encounter with reality, the world treated as an it, as an object, something you can kick around, pull apart, find out what it's made of. It gives science, of course, its great secret weapon of experiment. In science, you can repeat the same thing over and over again until you're convinced that you know what's going on. I was a theoretical physicist, hence a paper chap, but I would gladly acknowledge that my subject was largely driven by the discoveries of our experimental colleagues. But we all know there's another realm of encounter with reality. We meet reality not as an it, as an object, we meet it as a person, as a thou, if you like. When you enter that realm, the power of repetition, the power of interrogation is quite different. If I'm always setting little traps to see if you're my friend, I'll destroy the possibility of friendship between us. In the realm of the personal, and I would say the transpersonal encounter with divine reality, testing has to give way to trusting. It's a different form of encounter. So science and religion are different in these ways, asking different questions, looking at different kinds of motivating experience. By left it there, you might think they have their chalk and cheese, they've nothing to say to each other. But of course, the way they answer their questions, they're different questions, but the answers have to fit together. They have to be consonant with each other. If I were to say to you, I've just put the kettle in the refrigerator, I'm going to make a cup of tea, you would think there was something funny about what was going on. So there is a dialogue between science and religion, where their separate insights are brought together and to see how they relate to each other. And there are puzzles and problems in that sort of area, and I spent a lot of my time thinking about them. But by and large, I think it's a creative form of encounter, because again, it is part of this search for truth. And so, science and religion are friends and not foes. They have gifts to give to each other. The great gift that science has to give to religion is to tell religion what the nature of the physical world is like, what its history has been like. And that's a gift of great value, which religious people should accept with gratitude and take with the utmost seriousness. The fact that, for example, as we all know, the universe started about 13.7 billion years ago, extremely simple, an almost uniform expanding ball of energy, now become rich and complex, the home of saints and scientists. That's something to think about, and an astonishing fruitfulness might suggest that something's been going on in cosmic history, more than just one damn thing after another. So that's part of it. And it would suggest, I think, to religious people that evolving, coming to be of fertility would suggest to religious people that the Creator is not a God in a hurry, a God who is content to act through unfolding process rather than by instantaneous magic. That's an important feeling, I think, for understanding, for theology to take on board. So what can theology do for science? Certainly not to answer science's questions for it. We have every reason to believe that scientifically stable questions will eventually receive scientifically stable answers. They may be very hard to find. We all think of lots of questions we'd like to be able to answer, we can't answer today. But that's where we should look for the answers to them. But there are many questions, I've already suggested, which are not scientific in their character, which are meaningful and necessary to address. And interestingly, some of those questions arise out of our experience of doing science. They carry us beyond science itself. They are, if you like that sort of language, they are meta questions. And a very simple one is simply this: why is science possible at all in the deep way that it is proved to be? Now, of course, obviously, evolution must have shaped our brains in such a way that we can understand the everyday world. But why can we understand the quantum world? I worked in quantum physics all my time in science. Totally different from the world of every day, requiring for its understanding strange, counterintuitive form of thinking. And not only is the world deeply intelligible to us, but it's also deeply irrationally beautiful. My great scientific hero is Paul Dirac, who was a professor in Cambridge, and he made his great discoveries by a relentless search for beautiful equations. Because it has been found time and again in the history of theoretical physics that it's the beautiful equations that turn out to have that long-term explanatory power that persuades us that they're describing an aspect of physical reality. So why is the universe so rationally transparent to us? Why is it so rationally beautiful? These are features of the world that science is very, very happy to exploit, and exploits very, very well, but does not itself explain. But I think it would be extraordinarily lazy just to say, well, gee, that's a bit of a luck that you chaps who like mathematics. I think I'd like to understand why the world is so deeply intelligible. And my religious belief actually gives me, I think, a persuasive understanding of it. Because I've been describing a world which in its rational beauty and rational transparency is shot through with signs of mind, you might say. I think it is worth considering that it may not be, in fact I believe it is, the capital M mind of the Creator that lies behind that wonderful order. So that's why I think philosophy can be friends and foes. I like to say I'm two-eyed, I look with the eye of science on the world, I look with the eye of religion on the world, and I believe with that binocular vision, I can see more than I could with either eye on its own.
Okay, so our panel has been fairly loquacious so far. I think we're going to sort of jump straight into the audience, I think, and because we have a lot of people there, and I'm sure you have lots of questions. So let me just say one or two points before we. I think there will be. Is there a roving mic? So there is a roving mic which will come around. It would be good if you could wait for until the mic comes to you. If you could raise your hand and then wait till the mic comes. I would be grateful if you could keep the questions brief. And resist the temptation to give us a lecture. I'm sure you've got some great lectures out here. You can resist that temptation. Maybe some brief comments, but really we want questions to the panel. Give them a hard time, and that's why we're here. So, who wants to ask the first question, perhaps? Right on the front row here. That makes it easy to get the mic there. That's great. Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to go back to the Darwin conflict science theme. Isn't it the case that actually the conflict really is about almost deductions that are made from a theological perspective on the world and actual positive scientific understanding of phenomena? So I don't think Darwin had a problem necessarily with reconciling evolution and believing in initial cause. I think he wrote about that in one of his letters. But he had a problem with the idea of God creating a universe which was built upon competition, suffering, and the consequences of those things, and how did that reconcile with a benevolent God? And so it was almost a conflict between deductions that are made by positive science and the consequential theology.
John, I think this is for you.
Let me just say that I agree with everything you have just said. That seems to me a very correct and sensible analysis of the problem. Darwin said he'd never been an atheist, ever. But there's no doubt he became an agnostic late in life. And when he gives the grounds for his agnosticism, one recurrent theme is the sheer extent of pain and suffering in the world. And he was particularly sensitive to that because he lost one daughter, he suffered himself from ill health for many, many years, even as he was composing his Origin of Species. So you are exactly right. It's the interpretation placed on the world as we experience it, which is a world of pain and suffering, as well as a world of celebration and happiness. Darwin did actually say that he thought the amount of pleasure in the world did actually exceed that of pain. And I always feel there's something slightly reassuring and gratifying that he could actually think that. But you are right again in this sense, that the theory of evolution by natural selection, as he formulated it, did emphasize competitive struggle. And he thought that his theory would help us to understand why there is so much pain and suffering in the world. But if I could just finish with perhaps a slightly more heartening notion, there is a sense in which you could almost argue, and I'll say almost, that this suffering, if it is part and parcel of an evolutionary process that finally generated creatures of our intelligence and complexity, then a theologian looking to find some explanation for that suffering might very well look to the Darwinian theory as offering some kind of insight. And we could discuss that issue at great length. But it's one of these issues that can go, as I was indicating earlier, both ways.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. First of all, it's good, I think, to remind ourselves that when Darwin's great book, The Origin of Species, was published in 1859, there was a mixed response both in the scientific community and in the religious community. Richard Owen, for example, never accepted Darwin's ideas fully, with the greatest comparative anatomist of the day. And equally, there were people like Charles Kingsley who welcomed Darwin's ideas and said that Darwin had shown that God had done something clever in bringing into being a ready-made world, with a snap of divine fingers, and brought into being a world so endowed with fertility that the creatures could be allowed to make themselves by exploring, bringing to birth that potentiality. That, I think, is a helpful insight about that. The other thing is, undoubtedly, the most perplexing problem for religious belief is the evil and suffering in the world. And I think no religious believer who thinks about things at all can ever be unconscious of that. I think it holds more people back from religious belief than anything else. Science is mildly helpful in this area because it shows us that, as I think John has suggested in slightly different words, that though there is suffering and pain present in the world, it is not gratuitous. It's not something that a creator who is a bit more competent or a bit less callous would simply remove. We all feel if we'd been in charge of creation, we'd have done better. Get all the nice things, got rid of the nasty things. The science shows us that the processes of the world are interlaced in ways that cannot be torn apart. Genetic mutation is the engine which has driven the 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth, turning a world of bacteria into a world with you and me in it. That's the positive good. But genetic mutation also produces malignancy. And you can't have one without the other. There is a shadow side, I think an inescapable shadow side, to the fruitfulness of the evolutionary process. It doesn't remove all our perplexities by any means, but it is, I think, mildly helpful as we think about these serious problems. Usama.
I just want to add very quickly, since we're talking about reactions to Darwin, John William Draper, who was a contemporary and friend of Darwin and also president of the US Chemical Society, he wrote a book on the history of science and religion. And he said something very interesting in there about the Muslim approach to it. He pointed out, well, he knew that Muslim philosophers and thinkers and scientists had evolutionary ideas for centuries and precursors of those ideas. We think of people like Al-Jahiz and Ibn Miskawayh, Ibn Tufayl, and others. And he actually describes Darwinian evolution there as, or evolution as the Mohammedan theory of evolution of human beings from lower life forms, which is actually a very interesting quote. Now, I have to be careful what I say about it because earlier this year I was subjected to an inquisition around these ideas and even faced death threats for talking about this, and I had to retract my views publicly on that. But I just wanted to push that in. That there's a very interesting story to be told or analysed in terms of the Muslim world's approach to those ideas.
Thank you very much. I think we'll move on. We don't want to spend too much on one question. By the way, when you ask your questions, please do feel free to address them to a particular member of the panel, if you so wish. Otherwise, they'll just be taken as general. Please, sir. Thank you.
Well, leading up to my question, sorry?
Can you hold the mic right up this way?
Sometimes it overpowers, but yes, leading up to my question, I can't resist observing on the question with Darwin. It's always so difficult to read him because he played his cards so closely to his chest, depending on who he was writing to, who his correspondent was. His published works especially were wrapped in layers and layers of things that would be acceptable, following John Herschel's example of secondary laws as opposed to Sir William Lawrence, whose book got banned for blasphemy. But when you look at Darwin's early notes and his unpublished writings, he was much more materialist. But yes, he never, in any written form, went to all the way to Edgewood. But it brings me to Darwin, ever since Darwin, the phrase has been used, and before him, the progression of science, bringing religion changes. Religion, I hate to say, adapts and accepts more and more scientific ideas, and always through the viewpoint that this is illustrating God's greatness. And to the modern religious view of tolerance and inclusion of all ideas, But I never see addressed by a panel such as yours, the concept that, they try and say, or writers have tried to say, Stephen Jay Gould wrote an essay, that there are two separate magisterium, science and religion. But when I've looked at it, and I've pretty much since childhood held almost every part of the spectrum, from true believer to doubter to atheist, you have science, there can be a viewpoint where there is science which includes religion as a part of human anthropology that is explained by science, simply included in that great circle. Or you have a separate great circle of religion in which science is included as a small part of the religion, the creation of God. And I never quite see those two things addressed.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so really a question about non-overlapping magisteria. I think, John Brooke, you should start perhaps on that because of the historical aspects, and then perhaps we'll move around a bit. Thank you.
Yes, an extremely interesting question. Can I just endorse what you said? It is very difficult interpreting Darwin on religious issues because you can see him calculating in ways to avoid, I suppose, what he wants to do is to reduce any offence that he might give. It is for sure sometimes extremely difficult to read him. On the Stephen Jay Gould principle, as a default position, it has quite a lot going for it because it can avoid an awful lot of interpenetration of scientific and religious ideas in ways that are sometimes rather unwholesome. A lot of weeds grow up in that terrain where people try to show the mutual significance. But from my standpoint as a historian, the trouble with that NOMA principle, the non-overlapping magisterium, is that it does not represent what has actually happened in the history of science. Secondly, and this is perhaps rather more telling in many ways, Gould was never able completely to conform to his own principle. And in his own understanding of the Burgess shale, for example, he did admit himself that there were ideological features influencing his interpretation of that. In his controversy with Simon Conway Morris here in Cambridge, the respective metaphysical positions of each of them can actually be discerned in the scientific controversy that they have. So a lot depends on the level at which you analyse these issues. It's okay as a default position, but it's never quite going to work.
Oh, very clear.
Well, it's all related.
Yes, I was going to just say on the NOMA point that I think the problem with Stephen Jay Gould is the way he categorises religion. It's about values and science is about facts. So, he's excluding things that are factual from the religious realm. And a Muslim would want to talk about facts about Muhammad. I would certainly want to talk about facts about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We're talking and pursuit of truth in discovering those facts. Certainly, there seems to be overlap between ideology of one form or another and the science itself. In many instances, the kind of anthropic principle I was talking about is a question that comes out of science, but is one of these meta-questions that seems to demand a more metaphysical kind of answer or explanation. And that's happened in cosmology previously. There were ideological motivations of an atheistic kind behind the steady-state theory, with people like Bondi and Gould and Fred Hoyle, who certainly hated the idea that the universe had a beginning in time. From a theological perspective, God could create a universe that doesn't have a beginning in time. But that's been a perception. It's a perception today with Stephen Hawking, a more modern form That if you can get rid of the beginning of the universe, you can get rid of God. So certainly there's a lot of interaction, atheistically and theologically, with certain ideas that come out of science.
Anybody else?
No,
Yeah.
I tried in some sense to address this in the few words I spoke at the beginning. I think there's an important, of course, facts are involved in all forms of thinking about the nature of reality. I like to describe myself as a bottom-up thinker, trying to move from experience to understanding. The distinction is between repeatable facts, which is what science goes in for on the whole, and unique and unrepeatable facts, which all the rest of human encounter in reality, through music and the arts and religion and so on, are related to. So that's the distinction between the two. And I don't think the NOMA thing is at all attractive default position. I think it's an illusory default position because it's quite clear that these kinds of insight, though different from each other, are nevertheless influential upon each other. It's very popular. The NOMA position is quite popular among scientists who don't want to be disrespectful to religion, don't wish to take it very seriously either. And for example, I think I'm right in saying it's the officially endorsed position of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. But I think it's just a mistake. You cannot say that theological reflection on the nature of creation has been uninfluenced by discoveries in biological and cosmological science in the last 150 years. I mean, that's just manifestly untrue.
Sorry.
Yeah, very quickly picking up on something that Professor Holder said. I think we should remind ourselves some of the basis of religion, especially revelation. So for a Muslim, large aspects of the faith are based on trusting or accepting the Prophet, peace be upon him, who claimed to see certain things. So, he said that the angel Gabriel visited him and brought these revelations to him. He claimed to have travelled to the edge of creation, if you like, in his ascension, to have seen worlds beyond this world, heaven and hell and so forth, angels and other things. Jesus Christ, Moses, or Buddha, other religious figures in all religious traditions have those kind of claims. And I think there is a basic question there. Is there something to that, or is it something, as many atheists would say, I suppose, it's purely illusions going on in their minds? It's a question. I think it's something we also experience to some extent, and there are aspects, as Professor Polkinghorne said, of human experience which perhaps can be subjected to scientific experiment. One example I'd give is dreams. And the idea of prophetic dream is still very strong in the Muslim tradition. Everybody I know, certainly my family and many devout Muslims, will tell you they have seen things happening in the future in their dreams. I myself feel I've had several dreams I can remember very clearly, even dreams from childhood, which seem to be seeing something from the future. Now, it seems to me it is now possible to do scientific studies of that. We have lots of studies for the study of sleep, and I'm sure it's possible to get more and more people to write down their dreams as they happen, or just after they've happened, etc., and for somebody to do a comprehensive analysis of the dreams they wrote down at the time and then what they reported later. For example, and a lot of religious beliefs are drawn to a Jungian view of nature, or psychology, or synchronicity of the universe, of spirit, etc. It seems to me we should ask those questions. I think we should have more of that dialogue directly. So, for example, that question about suffering, I think religious believers must address that directly. About what you said about the metaphysical aspects of the multiverse. Of course, many scientists would argue that it's not metaphysical, and they have falsifiable criteria and predictions for that. So Lee Snowden, for example, is given an example. In the latest issue of the RAS, the Royal Astronomical Society of Astronomy and Geophysics magazine, it was the annual lecture where the professor is named on that number. But he gave a number of tests for the idea that our universe may be one of many, but there are certain parameters which perhaps can take a value within a certain range in different universes, but must have a certain value in our universe for us to be here, for life to exist. and in a sense that is a falsifiable test, and therefore it is a valid scientific theory. And to me, that's actually very exciting. And personally, I don't have a problem with the multiverse. I think, from my view of God, God is a great creator, the creator supreme. If God has created one universe, that's fine. If God has created trillions of universes as part of the multiverse, that's also fine. I think it's actually very exciting to explore that overlap. And I agree that there is an overlap, and it's very interesting to explore it.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we'll move on to another question. Please, gentleman right there, yes, in the white t-shirt. Yeah.
No. Well, we may bend our view of God. This is more about the theology of God. Well, we may bend our view of a God to fit in with science of the day, and to fit in with the findings of science. Surely the question is, because they're not mutually exclusive, the idea of a God and science, as we can change the idea of a God to fit in. The question is surely then whether it's necessary to believe in a God or not, because we can explain a lot of things about, or nearly all things about the world, or we will soon be able to explain all things about the world in a scientific way. Even ethics can be explained through evolutionary process. It is, if it's not necessary to believe in a God or whatever, then what background do we have? What reasons should we give to believe in one?
Thank you very much. Very good question. So, Rodney, science is all we need. No need for God. Over to you. You're up, Eric.
Yeah.
All right.
Eric. There's a question about change in the idea of God. I have quite a classical view of God. For St. Thomas Aquinas, God was a necessary being, the cause of all things. To me, that concept of God does the job that's needed to explain the existence of the universe and why the universe is as it is. You can go back to Aquinas' 5 ways. Now, of course, we do re-express those kinds of arguments in the modern world. And maybe our idea of God changes in some ways. But fundamentally, I think that idea of God as eternal, necessary, omniscient, omnipotent, maybe with certain qualifications, remains the view of God of most believers today. One sort of recent development, I suppose, changing the idea of God would be that God suffers, although you can see that certainly in Scripture with Christ becoming incarnate and suffering for us and with us, and I think that's something that would be a unique resource that Christianity brings to bear on the problem of suffering. I don't think explaining how something comes about, how maybe our moral intuitions come about through an evolutionary process explains why in some absolute sense, for example, torturing babies is wrong. I believe it is. I think that would be commonly accepted as an absolute truth, and it doesn't seem to me that science can tell me whether that's true or not. Certainly it can't do any experiments that would be at all helpful, even if they were ethical. So it does seem to me that the existence of a moral, and it does depend, I think, on there being an absolute morality, which I take there to be, that the reason we're in a universe of such a character, and that we have this consciousness of what is right and what is wrong, can't really be explained on the basis of an atheistic universe where everything is really a matter of chance. So maybe I'll leave that at that.
I certainly don't think the science can answer every question. I tried to say again, to illustrate that a little bit in my opening remarks. And I'm taking the question again, it's just an appendix to what Rodney said about morality. Of course, there are insights from evolutionary thinking which are helpful, I think, you know, kin altruism and reciprocal altruism, and these are insights you can see. But when evolutionary psychology tries to explain things like radical altruism, the way in which someone risks their life to rescue an unknown, unrelated person, it falls very quickly, it seems to me, to telling just those stories with an unpersuasive kind. And I think, again, going back to the example I started at the beginning, the deep intelligibility of the world seems to me is something that science explains, but specifically does not explain. And I must say I've found in my conversations with my non-believing scientific friends, that is one of the things that they do think quite seriously about. They see it as a serious issue. So I mean, science is great, but it's not, doesn't explain everything in my view, by any manner of meaning.
Yeah, just a couple of comments on that. Firstly, can I ask the question now? How old are you?
I'm 14.
14. Okay, my son's almost 14. He has a bit of catching up to do. But, that was very impressive. That was a great question. Yeah, I think this discussion have to continue. So, for example, on the torturing babies issue, which is an excellent one. We don't torture babies, but in many parts of the world we do experiments on primates, for example, and even dogs and cats. And, for example, a friend of mine, a couple of dogs pointed out to me, dogs have the emotional capabilities of a 2-year-old child, for example. Many scientists reckon. You can see that in the way the way these two dogs came up for attention, you know, competing for attention, just like children do. One got a hug, the other one wanted a hug as well, for example. So these issues do have to be explored and get closer to resolution before we advance that debate. And the wider point, actually, which I was trying to get at was, I think all believing scientists, and I'd love my fellow colleagues to comment on this, have to deal with the issue of, if we accept that God is not a scientific issue in the sense that science cannot prove or disprove God, then the term God is not a scientific term. Now again, there's a professor at the LSE who argued that in a paper a couple of years ago, saying God, all talk of God is meaningless to a scientist or within the scientific method, and therefore scientists should not be talking about God at all. It's not a scientific term. And that may be an obvious point, if you like, but I think it's something we have to deal with. How do scientists, and especially believing scientists, talk about such things that our academic disciplines are set up with such an emphasis on the scientific method, which has taken centuries to develop. But you know, you can't do an experimental test with God. And so how do you go about that, especially in a society where scientific nationalism seems to trump most areas of public discussion?
I'd like to say that I would deeply resent being told I can only speak as a scientist. I wish very often to speak simply as a human being.
Well, yeah. That's not said enough in public. I think in that sense the scientific rationalists have got a hold of the public discussion where believers are kind of forced into a corner and feel they can't speak like that, which is a big problem for me, I'm sure for others.
John, do you want to add anything to this discussion?
Perhaps just...
Yes.
I think that there is a phrase often used in books on science and religion which helps in answering that excellent question we've just had from the floor. There's a phrase, we call it the God of the gaps. The notion that if there's something you can't explain in science, let's bring in God to explain it. If that is your view of God and how language of God should be constructed, then of course you are absolutely right. As science has explained those processes, the how questions more fully, the God of the gaps does get pushed out of the world. But I think what Rodney said is also very helpful, because the God of the gaps is a caricature of what the best theologians have understood by the term God. And it's not clear to my mind either that advances in science require us to change the belief in a creator on whom the universe depends for its existence and continued being. So, finally, your question presupposes that all that we need to talk about is the question of need. Do we need a God to explain this? Do we need a God for this, that, or the other? And I think the religious experience of those who would call themselves believers is not cast in a language or a framework of need. It's more in terms of leading a life according to a particular orientation, a particular kind of faith commitment, which need not necessarily be irrational, but may be irrational. If that commitment enriches that person's life, as many religious believers would say that it does, then you have a different kind of justification for religious belief than simply invoking a deity to explain the inexplicability.
Good, lots of hands going up now. So please, there's a lady right at the back, and I think it's your turn. Thank you. Yes. Near the camera.
Thank you. I'd like to suggest that there is one area of human life where religion and science do seem to be at war, whether friends or foes or whatever, I'm not sure. And that is the area of sexuality and gender, where if one was to base one's life choices and ways in which one behaves to one's fellow human beings on knowledge and reading and understanding, hopefully we work well together. If we are to base it on beginning of Genesis and other comparable religious texts, we are forever banging up against being asked to do things or not do things that do seem to be irrational. In this city, we've seen how religious men would use lots of good reasons for keeping women out of lecture rooms, for example, and making sure that they did the childbearing. But also restricting the activities of men and for people who really are a mixture of all, of men, women, and mixtures. So that's where I find a big dilemma. And in the years when I tried to be a Christian, that was one of the areas that was a problem. And being more a human atheist, I find that evolution is a better explanation of the massive variety of human life, or even, I fear, of rape, than God's creation, especially a creation by a good God.
I definitely think we need to ask a previous president of the Cambridge College to answer that question first. So, John.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure how you wanted it, but really that argument.
Well, there's a reference to the brother women in Cambridge history, the history of the university.
Yes, actually, you have to remember that all human activity, and I believe this is also true about human religious activity, is a mixture between received culture, which shapes and sometimes distorts our view of the world, and our actual experience of the world. And so people always make mistakes in that sort of way. And I mean, I see, for example, if I take the Christian scriptures, if I take the Bible is, I believe, divinely inspired, but it is undoubtedly humanly written. And so, for example, when St. Paul, in the beginning of the 11th chapter of the first epistle of the Corinthians, bangs on about how the women ought to wear hats in church, I see that was a way of showing respect in the first century, but it isn't mandatory today. So all attempts at understanding things have to recognise the possibility of cultural distortion and the need to revise that. And undoubtedly we do make mistakes, and occasionally we're able to correct them. I mean, it took the Christian community 18 centuries before it realised that slavery was incompatible with human dignity. But we did actually get there in the end, I'm glad to say. So it's a mixed story, but nobody is exempt from this. Nobody is exempt from this. And other worldviews, other metaphysical views, if you like, big general worldviews, will have their own problems which they have to address.
I think the question was particularly also on the science. Or, I don't know, Rodney, you've written quite a lot. Did you want to comment? Or?
To be honest, I'm not sure how much of a science and religion question it is, except that perhaps, I mean, the male domination might be something that's been bequeathed to us from our evolutionary history and ancestry. If I do read scripture, I find that it isn't God's will that men should dominate women. Indeed, that seems to be a consequence of human sin. And St. Paul is a man of many parts. He also says that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, neither male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. So there's that insight too. There's the fact that Jesus himself had a lot of female disciples and was particularly concerned about women and some of his healings and so on. So Jesus himself was very pro-women, and St. Paul, for all his possible faults, had many women friends. So the church, John is quite right. The church has taken a long time to sort of catch up with this. Maybe it's still only just getting there with the debate on women bishops.
Okay, we're moving slightly outside our remit, which is science religion. Have you got a comment within the science religion framework? Because I think that we're just wandering a little bit away, but I want to keep it on the science we can. Hold on. No, I think we'll move on. It's just we've got to be a little bit focused, and there's a lot of hands. So, please, yay, at the back there. Yes. Sorry, I'm recognising a well-known Faraday course alumni. The back row.
Dr. Hasan, we absolutely could test for God if he existed, responding to our prayers. But if God exists, then he seems to ignore them when we make them, and that's part of the problem. However, my question to the panel is this: why do you think it necessary to invoke God to explain morality? What we deem moral or immoral is simply based on the principle of harm. An action is immoral when we cause unnecessary harm to others. So, for instance, if we torture children for fun, clearly we are causing unnecessary harm to them without any greater good or benefit. So there's simply no good reason to invoke God to explain human moral values.
Okay, John.
I don't see it as quite as straightforward as that. I mean, why should we refrain from doing harm to somebody else if it gives benefit to us? It's not self-evident in that sense.
But we do that when we send people to prison because of them harm.
So you have to shout if you're going to pick up.
We do that when we send people to prison because of them harm by taking away their freedom. But that's for a greater benefit to society to keep dangerous people locked up.
But I think myself. I didn't hear what you said there, but I think
So we send people to prison and do them harm.
well, that depends on whether you think imprisonment and legal punishment is punitive, or whether it's intended to be restorative, and that's an important argument in our society, and also, of course, restraining the safety. So, I'm not myself very much in favour of a purely punitive notion.
Sorry, can we just keep...
Yeah, that's the
thing. Yeah.
I think we have very deep moral knowledge. I mean, I think my knowledge of talking children is wrong if I'm certain about what I know about anything. But I don't see myself where that comes from. Just simply, in terms of an evolutionary explanation, it's not just, it doesn't seem to me it's a curious genetic survival strategy, nor does it seem to me just to be a convention of my society. We just choose in our society not to do that. I think it's a fact about the world. And for me, I don't say this is a knockdown argument, because it isn't, but the most persuasive understanding of the source of our deep ethical intuitions is that they are intimations of the good and perfect will of our Creator. So my religious belief makes sense of something. I don't say it's the only way of thinking about it, but to me it makes deep sense of something. I certainly wish to make sense of, understanding the reality in which we live.
Okay. Any other panel members want to comment on that particular point, or shall I move to your side? Yes?
Very quickly, because it was addressed to me about prayers. No, I don't think only religious charlatans would say something like, my prayer needs to be immediately answered by God right now in front of your eyes. So you have to be very careful how you frame that. Many people tell you they feel that their prayers are answered continually or in a long-term sense. But I take your point. I think it's a valid question around that, and the whole issue of morality and ethics. Professor Grading had written a humanist Bible recently, a compendium of teachings to how to live your life without God, if you like. And I haven't read it yet. I'd love to read it, and I think it's another example of a debate which has to happen between believers and non-believers, just as with the women question. Can I actually very quickly comment on coming back to your question on women, because Islam is often attacked for its position on women, and again there is a massive debate going on. So there are verses in the Quran which are gender equal in terms of the equality of believers before God, etc. Because we share the essential soul and the same soul. God having, if you like, masculine names as well as feminine names. There are other verses of the Quran which do talk about things like women having half the inheritance of men and men having a kind of high function in life over them. But and women having half the witness of men and half the inheritance, for example. Now at that time in Arabia, those were actually a step forward at the time, from women being complete second-class citizens or non-citizens at all, to having some kind of witness or inheritance. The debate is actually raging now in the Muslim world whether you stick to those rulings as they were in 7th century Arabia, or whether the idea was to begin a process of the liberation of women. And there are now leading Muslim theologians and scholars arguing for gender equality. Again, it's a fascinating discussion. But I agree with you that it's an area where science and religion do overlap again.
Okay, wonderful. Can we have a question now, please? We have one down.
Yeah,
Can you just wait for the mic? It's running ahead. Very quickly. Thank you. Yeah.
Good afternoon. In regards to religion and its doctrines, the various types of religions and science as such, in the more recent centuries, as we can look at, religion really has been the dominant factor, even though there were many great minds and scientists, but religion has always been the overriding power and the enforcer, if you like, of the doctrines preached by the different religious bodies in controlling the people as such and what would be accepted, where even though you had science coming through and great minds studying these great wondrous events coming in out of different discoveries, they were still being manipulated and kept down. So where are we looking at this? Where, if you're looking at religion as a foe or an enemy, it was definitely, I would say, looking at it through reading history, that it was definitely an opposing viewpoint and controlling aspect of between religion and history and science.
John, sounds like one for you. Here's the microphone.
I think what you've said captures a partial truth, but it's not the whole truth. You've said there, seeming to be referring to the last 300 or 400 years. It is true in this country, in the 19th century, the generation of scientists that included Darwin, Thomas Henry Huxley, John Tyndall, the physicist, did feel they had a battle to fight to win the same kind of public esteem, to be respected in society, and even to be able to do science as a profession that had been denied to their precursors. So this is one reason, actually, why we have this sense of a conflict between science and religion in the middle years of the Victorian period, because scientists are trying to emancipate themselves from the control of the church. But if you put it only in those terms, you also miss a lot. Within those religious traditions that you've characterised as trying to exercise control over belief, you will find that there are always liberals and reactionaries within those religious communities. It's also the case that many of the scientists that you would have to include in your story were loyal members of those churches themselves and were mediating between what they saw as important new science and the traditional beliefs valued and cherished by the very religious communities of which they were part. So I think simply to translate the question of power and authority that some of the churches did certainly exercise into a theory about science and religion being foes, that's the step in the argument that I don't think I would accept. It becomes much more complicated at that point. Three of the greatest scientists of the 19th century, if you're including people like Michael Faraday, James Clerk, Maxwell, evolutionary thinkers, two disciples of Darwin late in the 19th century. These are people who are mediating, not representing an antagonistic persona or an antagonistic position. Well, we could say more, but that's how I would come at that. That's how I would come at you, I think, on that.
Okay, we're going to move on because a lot of hands and time is against us. I think, well, here, sir, please. Thank you. Yes.
Listening to the discussion makes me wonder again.
It's not on, I'm afraid, so could you just have something or?
Listening to the debate makes me wonder whether we shouldn't distinguish between the existential and the, as it were, cosmological aspects of religion. The former, the existential, we haven't got a big problem with because there is this need for meaning, illumination, inner light, nowadays often called spirituality and so on. It's complicated, but it's there. Whereas the other aspect that touches on questions of creation and on the cosmic scale is a very difficult one. I know one or two astrophysicists myself, one of them is Christian, the other Jewish, and I occasionally ask them whether they agree with, that they don't remember what Pascal said almost 400 years ago, saying that the eternal silence of the universe frightens him. He was a scientist.
John, do you want to comment on that? Pascal? I think.
Well, yes, I mean, Pascal certainly said that. It's ironic in a way because, of course, we now know the universe is much, much more vast than Pascal even knew. 100,000 million stars in our galaxy, 100,000 billion galaxies in the observable universe. Nevertheless, if all those trillions of stars went there, we wouldn't be here. Because only a universe as big as ours could last the 14 billion years necessary for the evolution of a complex carbon-based life. So in a sense, even if there's no life anywhere else in the universe, we don't know one way or the other on that, those stars are not, so to speak, redundant. We should be grateful that they're there rather than being upset by them. But you're absolutely right. Of course, I mean, religious belief is a multi-dimensional form of belief. It has its existential demands as well as its intellectual demands. I mean, God is not there simply to satisfy our curiosity about cosmological questions. I think that the belief in God does place those questions in a broader and deeper context of intelligibility. But religious belief is much more dangerous than scientific belief. I believe in quantum mechanics very wholeheartedly, but it doesn't affect my life very much. My Christian belief affects my life in all sorts of ways. God is to be met not just as an object of curiosity, but with awe and obedience.
Okay, we've only got 5 minutes left, so we're going to have to keep moving, I'm afraid. And I think there's been a hand up in the middle there somewhere for quite a long time, but maybe it's gone down again. Okay, maybe it went down? Okay, please, sir, at the back in the blue shirt. Yeah, right by the pillar. Yep.
I have a question about the anthropic principle. So I would presume, it's a critique, and any of the panel members are welcome to respond. The critique is that I would presume that none of you would view the particular combination of people in this room, each one of which is a product of 500 billion sperm or so in one maternal egg, added onto that the particular combination of those individuals, which would yield a probability that, would be analogous to one atom out of those in the visible universe. I would presume that no one would make the argument that the particular grouping of people in this room is evidence for a purposeful, the universe was not created to support this particular group of people. Now, if as I presume, you would agree with what I just said, why would you use this probabilistic argument that we call the fine-tuning of the universe, the anthropic principle, to argue that the universe was itself created to support our existence?
Well, I think Rodney has written a lot about this, so Rodney.
Yes, thank you. You're right. That in a sense, every one of us in this room is contingent on a lot of eventualities, a particular sperm hitting a particular egg, and so on. But I think what it is about the universe as a whole, as opposed to with the set of parameters that take those very particular values that are necessary for this particular universe with all its complexity, culminating intelligent life to exist. The thing about that is that particular combination is not only immensely probable, but the result is meaningful. The vast majority of other combinations of the constants and initial conditions and so on would give rise to completely dead universes.
How do you know that?
Very easy. You change the expansion rate at the beginning by 1 part in 10 to the 60, and you get a universe which expands too fast for galaxies and stars to form, or recontracts too quickly, and so on. You change the strong force of nuclear physics, and you don't get any carbon and oxygen mates inside stars. This is the kinds of things we're talking about. The size of the universe, which John Polkinghorne mentioned. All these things need to be what they are. Now, I think it's worth mentioning, just by way of answer to your point, which is a good one, and others have made it, is to go back to an analogy which has been used by John Leslie of a firing squad, where you're lined up against a wall and so on. You've got these 12 sharpshooters. They aim, they fire, you blink, and you're alive. And so, do you say, well, if they hadn't all missed, I wouldn't be here to think about it, there are lots of, or there's some design there, and there's some reason why I'm here, they all deliberately aimed, or so on. So I think this particular set of parameters, which gives us a meaningful universe with such structure and complexity, is one that demands an explanation.
Okay, thank you. Please, sir.
This is a question to everyone in the panel. Some years ago, exactly 2004 September, I met a recent graduate at his wedding. He was a graduate of Princeton in particle physics. And during our conversation, we touched upon the existence of God. And he went on that as scientists, you need empirical, rational, thoughtful considerations to believe in God. He was an agnostic or an atheist. So that I left it at that. Later I went to my Sufi chef and I asked him, how do you address such an answer? So he said, ask him two questions. One, does he believe in faith? And two, if he says no, then ask him, can I give you an example of faith? So I asked my Sufi Sheikh, what is that example? He looked me in the eye and he said, your mother is the only one who can tell you who your father is. So I went back to the astrophysicist, particle physicist, and I said, do you believe in fate? He said, no. And I gave him this example. He was quiet. So my question to the panelists here, you are scientists, you are believe in religion, you believe in the ultimate God. Is your journey to God is an act of faith, or is a combination, or is on the basis of rationale and empirical evidence and scientific research?
Thank you very much for that question. John Polkinghorne, and the girl.
I have a lot of questions. Trying to well, wishful and weary about religion. You can see that science doesn't answer every question. But they think religion answers questions at an unacceptable cost. Because their picture of fate is you shut your eyes, you grit your teeth, you leave 6 impossible things before breakfast, and some unquestionable authority says that's what you've got to do. And of course they don't want to commit intellectual suicide, neither do I, I'm sure neither do you. So I'm always trying to show my friends, as far as I have an opportunity, that I have motivation for my religious beliefs. Just as I have motivations for my scientific beliefs. Of course there are different kinds of motivations, there are different kinds of beliefs. So that's why I describe myself as a bottom-up thinker, which means to move from experience to understanding, or starting at the 10th floor of clear certain general ideas, which usually turn out to be neither clear nor certain.
Yeah. Very quickly, well, that's a good example, but actually, scientists, I think, would validly give a counter-example. Our mums are not the only people who can tell us. We do have DNA tests now as well.
Post-1985.
Yeah, but we live post-1985, so I think we'll have to answer the legitimate objections from our scientific friends. But it's all part of that debate, so thank you for giving that example. Our friend in the back there, sir, your argument about God, I mean, I'd refer to a Sufi saying, which says that there are as many ways to God as there are human souls. I do not believe there's any one or two ways to try to say why we believe in God. There are a multitude of reasons. So I think that argument is very interesting. It's not particularly compelling for me, I have to say. For me, one of the most powerful things is just the idea of unity, which the Quran says that there is a unifying principle behind nature. And that unifying principle is, in a sense, what we call God, or Allah. And in another sense, for me, certainly, the Quranic God is certainly not a God of the gaps. It's a God of the filled-in bits, you like to call it. It's a God of what exists, because all of nature points to God as a sign of God.
Rodney.
Yes, I think I just want to say that faith and rationality are not two equal and opposite poles, but they go together. So, I mean, a lot of the kind of discussion you get in these fora, of course, is about the rationality, and it's about reasons for believing in God and so on. And I think there are very good reasons for believing in God. Some of the classical arguments as they're being revamped by the anthropic principle and all of the rest. But faith to me is about trust in a person of God, in Jesus Christ in my case, and living a life of prayer and worship in obedience to Him, and action in caring for others. Love God and love your neighbour as yourself, the 2 commandments that whereby Jesus summed up the law. So as John has said, it's a question of life and the way one lives it.
Yes, I think John Polkinghorne said very early on this afternoon that in our encounters with each other, and for religious believers, those who believe they are having an encounter with a transcendent other, there is an element of trust which comes into those relationships, which is of a rather different kind from what one might describe as the rationality of a scientific method. The Church Fathers used to speak of a faith seeking understanding, not a faith contrary to reason. And I think this is why I spoke earlier of a commitment which gives orientation to one's life, which is then itself enriching. And I think that's the sort of ground that I would look for when trying to articulate what we actually mean by faith. You made reference to, our friend here made reference to the unity of the universe. And perhaps as a historian I could just say, the idea of the unity of nature has been a profoundly important regulating principle in scientific work. And it was, in large measure, derived from a belief that this universe is the creation of a single intelligent being. Those two ideas do go together, and they did in Isaac Newton spectacularly. The universality of the gravitation law for Newton is grounded in the fact that the beauty of the universe could only have come about through what he calls the counsel and dominion of an intelligent being. So the idea of unity, which is important in the Christian tradition and in the Muslim tradition, has been of great significance in scientific work.
Well, thank you very much. We did promise people we would finish by 4. We've just gone a couple of minutes over. May I say that you have been a truly wonderful audience with some fantastic questions. I do apologise we didn't get to everybody's question. I'm so sorry. This is a big discussion. It could go on till midnight. We won't go on to midnight. But first of all, well, lastly, I should say, let's really thank our panel very much for their help.